and the rain. Anyway, so yeah, my talk has a lot to do with the title that you see in the program, but it's a little bit different as I've been thinking about these issues. And it really begins with a problem that I first discussed with Jerry when he was the mayor about 5 or 6 years ago. I've only been a resident of Montclair for about 4.5 years. And so I was secretly contemplating coming to Montclair for many of the reasons that brought the rest of you here. And Jerry and I were sitting in Raymond's, and he was asking me, in my role as a professor and in the work that I do, how we can maintain our economic and racial diversity in this town, given so many of the changes that have occurred. And so if that's the problem then, if that was the problem then, it remains the problem now. And I want to discuss it in the context of the preservation of diversity, but I want to challenge the term diversity a little bit and talk about the possibility of just inclusion. So this problem that has persisted for longer than the time when Jerry first broached the question is a problem that's bigger than Montclair, but Montclair can play a central role in trying to address it both here and in the region. And it can be understood in these sorts of colloquial terms. If you can work here, if we can know you on a daily basis as our neighbor behind the counter in retail shops that we frequent and love, then why can't you afford to live here? And if you were raised here, why shouldn't you be able to expect to return and stay here after you've done whatever wonderful things you've done in the world to advance your life chances? So there are a number of ways to think about the problem, but I want to start by saying that I think I've lost part of my slide here, but I want to first point out that Montclair, as important as this issue is, represents a very unique municipality. All right, there's some research ongoing at Climb with the urban scholar David Rusk on what we call DIMIs, D-I-M-I, which is a diverse, inclusive, moderate income municipality. And the problem of DIMIs is represented really in some respects by Ferguson, Missouri. Ferguson, Missouri being a place that has increasing amounts of diversity since about 1980, but remains, at least in St. Louis County, Missouri terms, a very mixed and diverse community that is clinging in some respects to that diversity as more and more whites leave, but also faces, as the Justice Department determined in its investigation, facing severe fiscal stress. And this is a problem that our DIMI analysis is showing all over this region, right? So David and I looked at about 14 northern New Jersey counties, and we find that municipalities that are truly middle income and also significantly diverse, particularly with respect to having a sizable, that is more than 10% Black and Latino population, are extraordinarily few. Extraordinarily few, because what happens is essentially what has happened to Ferguson and its neighbors, that as whites have left, fiscal stress has increased. And as immigrants come to this country, they settle not as much in cities, but in these inner ring suburbs. And so these inner ring suburbs represent, in some respects, the future of the United States, because they are the population centers. They're the areas where we see the greatest amount of growth. They're the areas where we see the greatest amount of affordable housing based on market rates. But they are also places that are increasingly resegregating. The white population is leaving, and minority populations are predominating in some places very rapidly. So the point is that Montclair fits into this picture at the upper end of the income scale. If you imagine being about 150% of area median income down to about 50% of area median income, comprising the band that is a DIMI, Montclair and South Orange are way up at the top. And we go down to places like Belleville and Nutley and some of the other towns that have seen dramatic changes in their populations. So part of what we're talking about in preserving diversity on an economic and a racial basis is to do it where you really have economic diversity and where you also really have an ethos of inclusiveness, as opposed to merely demographic trends where affordability dictates who gets to live there, because that tends to lead toward fiscal stress. So we are unique. We are probably one of, is it what I'm saying that's causing this? Are these miniature lightning strikes? We are probably, without boring you with the data, one of about six municipalities in all of the 14 North New Jersey counties that is at the high economic end of a DIMI. We are unique. We have to preserve what this is, because what we're able to do with the resources is to provide much stronger institutions closely associated with opportunity for more and more and different residents. So, when you think about how this problem evolved, there are recent factors and there are more regional factors, some of which I've just alluded to. So there's market pressure, of course, from Manhattan and Brooklyn. We came from Brooklyn. We represent that Brooklyn market pressure, where things here are just a whole lot more reasonable than anything you can purchase in Brooklyn, and so it drives a lot of people here who then obviously drive up market prices. There's been better transportation links to the city, and anybody who's been here longer than I knows how much easier it is to get to the city, to a job in the city through mass transit from Montclair. We have terrifically big houses and yet quite a varied housing stock, so we've got the wonderful pre-war homes that attract a lot of folks of means, but we also have starter homes, which is not terribly common in places like this across New Jersey. We have decent schools, which drive people here, but we also have incredibly high taxes, which drive people out. And as far as regional factors, we have this demographic concentration that I just alluded to in the context of Ferguson and in the DIMI study. We've also in this state, but most relevant to us here in this region, had a loss of political discourse around fair housing. It's clear we have a governor who is antagonistic to the notion of fair housing, both at the state level and at the federal level. And as a consequence, and perhaps because of other reasons that aren't driven entirely by the governor himself, there's really been a different kind of a conversation around the urgency of fair housing, and that naturally will affect how important it is for towns to work hard on creating affordable housing. Reflected in this discourse, this collapse of the discourse around fair housing, is the collapse of the Council on Affordable Housing itself, the state agency charged with the responsibility of implementing New Jersey's Fair Housing Act, which follows the Mount Laurel Doctrine, which I imagine you'll hear much more about. But in essence, we've been stagnant as far as the production of affordable units over about the last 15 years. So when people talk about the success of the Mount Laurel Doctrine and the New Jersey Fair Housing Act, they're really talking about something that's successes that are almost a generation old. We've been stuck in impasse for such a significant period of time. And the New Jersey Supreme Court has decided to essentially relieve COA of its responsibilities for overseeing the act, really for a lack of serious commitment to its statutory obligations. So this is critically important because it trickles down to the leadership, to the locally elected leadership in municipalities across the state, and determines how important it is to stand behind some of the legal obligations that flowed out of that important series of cases. And then finally, what we see across the landscape is a kind of privilege hoarding. We see increased racial segregation. New Jersey is the third most segregated state in the country. Most of that segregation, frankly, is in northern New Jersey. And we see, almost in overlapping maps, economic stratification. So this is just a picture of some of what we're talking about. This is change over time, measured in the classroom. It is a change in in the racial complexion of public school students, as well as the economic status of public school students. And so let me just point out a place like Bloomfield over the last, well, this isn't the last 12 years, but beginning from 2000 to 2012, we're looking at 12-year increments, saw an increase in its Black and Hispanic K-12 students of 25%. So that's that rapid demographic change that I've been talking about reflected in the classroom. And those who are free and reduced meal lunch eligible, which is 130% of the poverty level or less, so it's a good proxy for serious economic stress in a family, increased during that same period by about 8%. And you see this at a lot of different places. So 18% change in West Orange, a dramatic change in what that means for school teachers and for the district themselves in teaching students from those homes and with those kinds of resources and those kinds of constraints on parents. Belleville, a 20% change in the free and reduced meal lunch. South Orange is 6%, but then here's the problem, again, that Jerry raises. Montclair, a 7% decrease. Montclair's change in Black and Hispanic school kids, a 10% decrease, right? So you all know that Black folks, and it's mostly Blacks and whites, although an increasing population of Latinos in this town, but it's mostly still that Black-white binary. We've seen over the last couple of censuses dramatic reductions in the Black population in Montclair. And then if you look at the bottom, you see Milburn, Livingston, and Roseland, regional neighbors who have borne 0% of any of this change. Right? So whatever this means, whether you consider it to be a normative good or whether it's simply what happens as a result of demographic and economic shifts, these three have not participated. They have somehow managed to keep themselves exactly as they were 12 years ago. So this is also the inequality crisis, but it's the inequality crisis in local structural terms. And we tend to talk about income inequality as if it were the be-all and the end-all of the discussion on inequality, but as you all probably know, most of this is place-based. Most of this happens at the level of structure. What it really means to be unequal is to have unequal access to the means to opportunity in this country. And those means to opportunity tend to flow through local institutions like schools, like libraries, like the YMCA. I mean, really Montclair is such a perfect example of so many strong local institutions that really help to fortify the family resources that help people improve their life chances, no matter what kind of family they come from. So what it also means, though, is that there is a relationship between income, because income helps to determine the strength of the tax base, and the tax base in turn helps to determine the strength of the local institutions, the breadth of the institutions, whether or not you can rely on public safety, the relationship you have with your police, how many police you're able to continue to afford. Oh, wrong way, there we go. So here's yet another, and I don't want to belabor these charts, but sometimes people don't believe you unless you bring charts, so I wanted to make sure you saw some charts. But here again are some municipal comparisons of median family income to reflect the growing regional inequality we see that then has clear repercussions for institutional resources. This is beyond well, it's not beyond our region, but it's not our immediate neighbors. But it gives you a sense, and really what it comes down to is what I'd want to highlight is a growing trend where the gap is now 3 times between towns in the 95th percentile in their tax base per capita and towns in the 5th percentile. So just as we talk about income inequality among individuals and among households, we can talk about resource inequality among municipalities. And as we do that, if we were to map that in terms of Jerry's original question, racial composition and economic composition, you'd see an almost one-to-one correspondence with towns like ours being very much the aberration, although I would argue the ideal. And then this is tax base per capita, and Jerry very carefully pointed out that there is there's a typo in this. This is number 6. I want to give Jerry credit for finding the typo. But the point again being that there's a relationship between median income. And between median income and between tax base per capita that then is reflected regionally as you compare different municipalities to show a tremendous disparity of resources on behalf of town elected officials to provide for the needs of their households. And that ultimately is what we're talking about in terms of the internalization of resources that lead to greater opportunities for individuals and families. So how did all this come about? Well, it came about through a kind of a system of that we legal scholars call localism, a non-racial residential gerrymandering of institutional opportunity through self-government. I mean, it is really in many respects the best of what we offer in terms of our form of local democracy. It enshrines within jurisdictional boundaries the right to police oneself, the right of local sovereignty over issues that the Constitution calls police powers, things like land use and actual police powers, and education, including limited taxing authority. And it is through these particular levers that towns are able, in the words of the Supreme Court, through many, many decisions, to determine the character of their own community, as well as to maintain a sense of fiscal and cultural self-sufficiency. So all of this is a democratic good thing, and most of us in this room who love this town and love its institutions and its traditions would say localism is a good thing. It is what makes us different, and we would not want to be controlled from the institutions beyond us, the municipalities beyond us, that don't in many respects speak for us and our values. And I'm not here to disagree with that, but I am here to show you that localism as a set of legal norms to which great deference is given by courts has a tendency to reproduce segregation and to reproduce economic inequality. It does so primarily through this device here, and that is through racial neutrality. So if, in fact, it comes about that your town, not this one, has 95% white residents and is generally considered affluent, you can bet that much of that was by zoning design, by land use policies, mostly reinforced after the passage of the 1968 Federal Fair Housing Act. So there are plenty of places around this state, not just in this region, that decided to use zoning policy, what some of you may know as exclusionary zoning, large lots, minimum floor area ratios, and the like, to ensure that housing would be financially out of reach for minorities. And it worked. Of course, it's also caused the housing crisis in many of those places because there's no such thing as a starter home, and people simply can't afford and don't want to live on homes with such an enormous footprint. But nevertheless, that pattern of local decision-making has permeated so many towns in New Jersey that it has become the blueprint for a kind of continuing racially neutral segregation that works at the level of race and works at the level of class. And it is that sort of process that we are constantly, in towns like Montclair, struggling against. Why? Not so much because we are so much the perpetrators of such policies, not that we're blame-free, but we certainly have a very different lay of the land. What makes us, in some respects, the victims of policies like that is that we get the other folks. We bear disproportionate burdens in the same way that Ferguson, Missouri, and its surrounding suburbs did. We bear the burdens, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but we bear the economic burdens of concentrated diversity because it has not spread out across the state, because it cannot spread out across the state because of things like localism. Okay, so we ask generally for diversity. We seek it as a norm, but we rarely question it. And I have to tell you, quite personally, as a law professor who's recently sat in on all sorts of meetings about diversity, I am personally appalled, maybe appalled is too strong a word, I'm impatient with the tendency to hear people refer to diversity students, diversity hires, diversity candidates. When I was born in 1964, I was born black. In 1978, I somehow became a diversity candidate or diversity student. What did this was Justice Powell's opinion in the Bakke decision, a decision involving affirmative action in med school admissions. The Bakke opinion is critically important for introducing this idea of diversity into our lexicon. It is an idea, therefore, that has in many respects allowed affirmative action to persist in a different name. But not just in a different name, but also for a different purpose. No longer in order to remedy the continuing effects of past injustices, but rather to create a beneficial surrounding, a beneficial learning environment, all of which may be very good. But because that beneficial learning environment is overwhelmingly white, diversity is primarily a good through the eyes of whites. And so to hear strong people of color reduced to a label that no longer reflects who they are intrinsically, but what they are in representing and advancing an idea is a little bit pernicious. So I don't want to be living in my neighborhood, which happens to be predominantly white, and be the diversity neighbor. And I don't want my girls to grow up to be the diversity girls in the neighborhood. And I don't want them to bear that burden, in part because it's not true, it's not a label that they would put on themselves, it's an obfuscation of what diversity was supposed to mean, it's demeaning, and most importantly, it can run out, right? We can have enough diversity. We can have just enough, so that the next person who comes through after we've finished our quota of diversity is no longer judged on the merits. Because after all, that's what he or she was all along, right? That's our, we've got enough diversity teachers here. We've got enough diversity social workers. We've hired our last diversity doctor. And so the next doctor who walks in the room who happens to be Latina is just not likely to be judged on the merits because everyone is so accustomed to reading her through that particular lens. So I challenge this notion of diversity a little bit. And suggest instead that we think about something less othering, like inclusion, and the benefits of that, which I think living in this town we all recognize are quite real. Many of them deliberate, but a whole mess of them quite accidental and quite lovely as they just hit upon us in our daily lives because of the statistical diversity that we actually enjoy. So inclusion sort of goes back to the notions that gave rise to affirmative action and says this is still about a struggle for social justice. This is still about a struggle for equal access to resources. This is still about trying to buck a trend that in 2016 makes this town such a standout, merely one of a handful of municipalities in this entire 14-county North Jersey region that has the kind of statistical diversity that it has, and not by accident. So inclusion has to be something that you're really committed to. And it has to aim at belonging. It has to recognize the problem of the distances among us that occur in so many different ways. And it has to involve us equally so that we all would want to be known by that label and not simply talked about with that label. So, what can we do? Well, I don't think I have the answer that Jerry hoped I would have 5 years ago. I was particularly vague then, and I'm going to be a little vague now, notwithstanding what it says in the program. But I think that we want to look at three things as a general matter. I think, first of all, we want to think about improving upon what we have. You know, when I teach this subject at Rutgers Law School, one of the questions that inevitably arises is, well, when can we expect change? How should we think about the process of change? Everything seems so overwhelming, it seems so insurmountable. You know, are we going to have it in a year? Are we going to have it in a matter of months? Can we hope to have it by the time I graduate? Those kinds of things. I tend to think of things a little more incrementally now, and I hope that's not a sign of age. But I tend to think of things at this structural level in 10-year increments. And to focus upon the strengths. I don't know that we're going to become this sort of magical utopia of racial and economic inclusion. But I do know that we have some strengths that bear improving upon. And one is to focus upon our affordable housing, both the sale of affordable housing and the rental of affordable housing. And I have been here long enough to hear some of the fights in council meetings around affordable housing. And I have to tell you, some of the things that I hear said by some of my neighbors sound just like what I would expect to hear from neighbors 2, 3, 4, 5 counties away that have no folks of color and who satisfy their COA obligations with elderly white people only. It is very sad to hear that, but we have to work on that. It doesn't just magically happen. You're not sort of branded a liberal and these are the things that you think about. You have to think much more carefully and diligently about the quality of your connections to people, about what you have and why you have it and why it's important that it's shared with others, right? That we don't have this sort of quota on how charitable I'm willing to be to tolerate the presence of this other. This is critically important, and it comes down to these sorts of brass tacks decisions that we make about how many units of affordable housing we will tolerate and who these people are who are likely to fill them. These people are folks who need it. These people typically are folks who have been counseled on how to use it. They've also been screened, but they're also us because they work in the 7-Eleven, right? And they work serving us food in our restaurants and cleaning up after us in the, in our health clubs. So it's critically important that we continue our strong tradition of providing affordable housing, notwithstanding the fact that we are probably overdoing it relative to our neighbors. Secondly, we are blessed to have a strong, historic black community in the town of Montclair. It is not like a lot of towns that would have to sort of develop a black community. You know, we have one with as much right to be here as anybody else, who have been as much stakeholders in the creation of what this beautiful place really is. And as I mentioned earlier, that population is at risk because that population, by and large, not entirely, there's some very wealthy black folks here, but by and large, fits at the bottom cohorts of the income scale in town. And so as things become more expensive, they are disproportionately at risk. We have to think about that with a sense of pride and protectiveness to make sure that our own can stay. Because a town that already has that population starts out at a much greater advantage over the question of inclusiveness than one that has to learn it from whole cloth. And then finally, to this question of equity, to the question of is it fair for Montclair to continue to bear the burden of trying to provide adequate rental housing that's affordable to people who live here, to people who were raised here, and to a region that is increasingly seeing the spillover effects from Manhattan and Brooklyn's real estate market. The answer really is no, it's not fair. It's not fair. But one of the consequences of a fragmented political map like we have in New Jersey with 566 municipalities, is that people don't talk to each other. Municipalities don't talk to each other. So they don't really know what's happening in each other's space. And therefore, there isn't as much opportunity for leadership on these kinds of issues. So many of the groups I've been involved with have looked hard at this and seen opportunities for politicians in our town, for political leadership in our town, as well as the support of or the creation of local resident organizations and committees to push the policy of regional equity, particularly with respect to affordable housing, to make known the disparities, to lead the way and to suggest that other towns, COA or no COA, Fair Housing Act or no Fair Housing Act, must bear their fair share of providing opportunities for other people to live, that we can be a model of how to do it, but that we don't just sort of stay insulated within our capacities, but instead take on the responsibility of being a regional, if not a statewide leader in how you do it, how you sustain it, and that you must do it. Thank you.